Welcome back to, I was going to say Monday, but Wednesday's Bible study. It's great to have you here once again. We're going to be talking about the kings. We're still on the list of kings. We are going to be discussing King Amaziah, King Uzziah, and Jotham, or Jotham. So we're going to continue doing that. Thank you, by the way. I'm grateful and thankful that you listen to these videos. I'm always grateful and thankful. I'm always surprised anybody goes ahead and listens to these, and I'll never stop being thankful. No matter if I had one subscriber or 1,001 subscribers, I'm very grateful that you're here. So let's go ahead and get right into this. We're talking about King Amaziah, which was the 10th king of Judah. He was a fascinating figure to some, whose reign is chronicled in the second book of Kings, chapter 14, verses 1 through 22, and also in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 25, verses 1 through 28. His reign provides a poignant lesson on the consequences of mixing faithfulness with half-hearted devotion to God, as well as the dangers of pride and self-reliance. One would say he had a good start, but a bad finish. Amaziah began his reign with notable promise, as many kings have. He ascended to the throne at the age of 25 and reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem, which is covered in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 2. The Bible, the King James Bible, tells us that he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a perfect heart. The phrase, or this phrase, is key, I think, to understanding his reign. It suggests that while he started with good intentions, his devotion to God was incomplete and ultimately unstable. Amaziah began by avenging his father's death, who was the previous king Joash, by executing those who killed him, though he spared their children as the law of Moses required. This was an act of righteousness. When it came to religious reforms, he sought to maintain and reestablish true worship in Judah. For instance, he commanded the worshippers of idols to be removed, trying to purify the religious practices in Judah in 2 Chronicles chapter 25. However, as we will see, his devotion to God was ultimately compromised. We talk about the military campaign against Edom. Amaziah's military campaigns began with success, notably his conquest of Edom, which, if you know the history of Edom, they were very much into idolatry. He led a successful campaign against the Edomites in the Valley of Salt, a military victory that would further solidify his reign. This victory was seen as a sign of divine approval. But with this came pride and overconfidence. After his victory over Edom, Amaziah's pride swelled. Way too big. He got what one would say too big for his britches. He even brought back the idols of Edom and began worshiping them. This act of idolatry was one of his major failures. Rather than continuing to honor the God who had given him victory, he turned to the gods of his enemies. The turning point in Amaziah's reign came when he foolishly challenged Israel to battle. After his victory over Edom, he felt emboldened and decided to pick a fight with Israel, even though he had no cause for such a conflict. He sent a challenge to Jehoash, I pronounced that wrong, Jehoash, king of Israel, not to be confused with his father Joash, the former king of Judah. He was requesting a military confrontation, which took place in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 8. Jehoash's rebuke was, rather stinging. Jehoash responded with a parable of a thistle and a cedar, warning Amaziah that he was overestimating his strength. The message was clear, very clear. Amaziah was a small, insignificant king compared to Israel's power. Jehoash advised him to stay content with his victory over Edom and not provoke a war with Israel. But ignoring this warning, Amaziah went ahead with the war anyways. And Israel decisively defeated Judah in the battle at Beth Shemesh. Amaziah was captured, and the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Israelites, who also took treasures from the temple and the royal palace. After his defeat, Amaziah's pride and self-sufficiency led to his eventual downfall, as it always does. Although he returned to Jerusalem, his reign was marked by internal strife and an erosion of his authority. Then there was a conspiracy that was formed against him, and he was eventually assassinated by his own people. In 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 19. Is there anything we can learn from Amaziah's life? While Amaziah began his reign with a genuine desire to follow God, his failure to fully commit to God's ways, illustrated by his idolatry after his victory over Edom, shows that partial obedience is not enough. The Bible makes it clear that wholehearted devotion to God is essential. We are not to be partakers in the idolatry of the world and other countries, territories. Amaziah's pride, particularly after his victory over Edom, led him to challenge Israel and ultimately brought about his downfall. His overconfidence in his military success rather than giving glory to God. And that led him to and into a disastrous conflict. Amaziah's adoption of the idols of Edom demonstrates the dangers of syncretism in idolatry. It was a sign that while he may have started well, his faith was not deeply rooted in God alone. His conflict with Jehoash illustrates the importance of humility. Jehoash's response showed that true strength comes from God. And challenging a stronger adversary out of pride leads to disaster. And I would even say challenging anyone out of pride will lead to disaster. I guess one would say, or could say, that Amaziah had a mixed legacy. Amaziah's reign serves as a reminder of the importance of wholehearted devotion to God. While he did some good things, like eliminating idolatry early on and avenging his father's death, his later actions demonstrated how a king, like any individual, can fall into complacency and pride, leading to destruction. I guess you could say ultimately, Amaziah's life and reign did illustrate the delicate balance between starting well and finishing well in the service of God. His life is a warning that initial zeal for righteousness is not enough. Sustained faithfulness, humility, and trust in God are necessary to avoid this ruin. Next, we're going to get into King Uzziah. King Uzziah, also known as Azariah, was one of the most notable kings of Judah, reigning for 52 years during the 8th century. His reign is remembered as a period of relative prosperity, military success, and religious innovation. But it was also marked by pride and a tragic downfall. It's amazing how those can be built up to such a level that now they are prideful of what they have and that they are greater than others. And then that becomes their downfall and destruction. Uzziah's story serves as both a model of early success and a warning against this particular pride, or any pride, and disobedience to God's commands. Uzziah became king at the age of 16 after the death of his father, King Amaziah. The chronicles provide more detailed insight into his early reign, describing him as a king who sought God and was blessed for it. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah did. 2 Chronicles 26:4. This favorable comparison to his father reflects a positive start for Uzziah's reign, especially in the religious and military spheres. Now we get into the religious, as they called it back then, and political reforms at that time. During the early years of his reign, Uzziah was led by the prophet Zechariah, who instructed him in the ways of the Lord. The Bible tells us that as long as Uzziah sought the Lord, God made him prosper. Uzziah enjoyed great success in military campaigns. He expanded Judah's territory and secured its borders, particularly in the areas of Philistia, Arabia, and the Ammonites. 2 Chronicles chapter 26, 6 and 8. His military innovations included the construction of fortified cities and the creation of a well-equipped army, contributed to Judah's security and prominence. Uzziah's reign also saw economic prosperity. He developed infrastructure, including agriculture, fortified cities, and strategic military outposts, which helped Judah grow wealthier and more stable, as mentioned in 2 Chronicles 26:10. His reign was characterized by peace and progress in many areas. God's blessing was evident in Uzziah's reign through his military victories, economic prosperity, and political stability. The Bible tells us that God helped him in all that he did in 2 Chronicles 26:7. Uzziah was particularly successful in engineering, introducing new technologies to Judah, such as the use of catapults for military defenses. These developments were signs of the favor that Uzziah received from God. Uzziah's reign was, for the most part, an era of great strength and accomplishment. His leadership allowed Judah to experience military dominance and economic security, leading to a high degree of national pride. But despite his early faithfulness and prosperity, Uzziah's downfall is attributed to a dangerous pride that ultimately led him to act recklessly and disobey God. The turning point in his reign occurred when he became proud of his accomplishments and arrogantly overstepped his authority. In a moment of pride and overconfidence, Uzziah entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. an act reserved exclusively for the priests of the lineage of Aaron. The priestly office was sacred, and the offering of incense at that time was not a privilege to be taken lightly. When the high priest Azariah and 80 other priests confronted him about his unlawful actions, Uzziah was angry and refused to listen to their rebuke. At that moment, leprosy broke out on his forehead as a visible sign of divine judgment for his disobedience in 2 Chronicles 26:19-20. The priest quickly drove him out of the temple, and Uzziah, now a leper, was forced to live in isolation for the rest of his life. The Bible notes that he was cut off from the house of the Lord, 2 Chronicles 26:21, meaning he was no longer able to fulfill his royal duties or maintain any of his former influence. Oh, a leper. And a tragic end, huh? Uzziah's leprosy was a physical manifestation of his spiritual rebellion against God. His pride had led him to ignore God's clear commands about the roles of kings and priests. Uzziah's arrogance in assuming the role of a priest resulted in him being cut off, not only from the temple, but also from his kingdom's governance, as he could no longer fulfill his duties as king. Uzziah's legacy, like many others, serves, as many others, a cautionary tale. Uzziah's reign ultimately ended in what? Tragedy. Though he had been a successful and prosperous king, his pride led to his downfall. And he died isolated and unceremoniously, one would say, in a leper's house. His son Jotham took over the day-to-day governance of the kingdom while Uzziah remained a leper until his death. What are some of the lessons we can learn from Uzziah's life? What about the danger of pride? Uzziah's pride was the root cause of his downfall. His success led him, in the end, to forget God, who gave him that success, and to assume that his own strength could overcome God's boundaries. The Bible warns that pride goes before the fall, does it not? Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18. What about the importance of humility? Even though Uzziah achieved great things, he failed to remain humble before God. Humility before God and submission to his will is essential, no matter how successful or powerful one becomes. Uzziah's humble beginnings had helped him succeed, but his later arrogance led to his spiritual ruin. Uzziah's transgression in the temple showed that God is holy, and his commands regarding worship and service must be honored. The roles of the priesthood and the monarchy were distinct for a reason, and Uzziah's attempt to blur those boundaries had serious consequences. His disrespect for God's holiness in assuming the role of a priest at that time was an act of sacrilege. What about the need for accountability, which is sad even these modern times? Sadder too. When confronted by the priests and the prophets, Uzziah should have listened. His refusal to listen to godly counsel led to his isolation and disgrace. This clearly shows the importance of heeding wise counsel, especially when we are in positions of authority. Uzziah's story is indeed a tragic reminder of the dangers of pride. the necessity of humility, and the importance of honoring God's will in all aspects of life. His early faithfulness to God resulted in great blessings, but his prideful overreach brought about divine judgment. Despite his earlier successes, Uzziah's legacy is ultimately, again, a cautionary tale of how spiritual failure can follow material and political success. His reign serves as a reminder that no one is beyond the need for continual humility and dependence on God. That was just King Uzziah. We're going to get into King Jotham. Let's get into him next. King Jotham was another king of Judah. Even though he is a relatively lesser known figure in the biblical narrative, his reign is significant for the stability and prosperity he brought to Judah, especially in contrast to the later chaotic reigns that will follow. Jotham's story is recorded in 2 Kings. I think it's 2 Kings, right? 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 32 through 38, and 2 Chronicles chapter 27, 1 through 9. His reign is often viewed in a positive light, though the Bible will provide only a brief account of his life. As mentioned before, Jotham was the son of King Uzziah, and he succeeded his father after Uzziah's death from leprosy. Because remember, Uzziah had reigned for 52 years, but was then struck with leprosy after he unlawfully entered into that temple and attempted to burn incense, which we discussed was a duty reserved for the priests at that time. But after that, Jotham had to kind of take over. He served as a co-regent during the final years of his father's reign. When Uzziah died, Jotham took full control of Judah's throne at the age of 25. That's in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 33, and 2 Chronicles 27:1. Jotham's early rule was marked by wisdom and spiritual faithfulness, likely influenced by the legacy of his father, Uzziah, though his father's prideful fall must have served as a reminder of what can happen. The Bible indicates that Jotham did that which was right in the sight of the Lord in 2 Chronicles 27:2. This phrase is usually used to describe kings who remain faithful to God. Jotham reigned for 16 years, from approximately 750 to 735 BC. And his reign is often, or you can say BCE, it's another way of saying it. And his reign is often viewed positively, particularly because of his commitment to righteousness and his focus on the spiritual health of Judah. While Jotham did not achieve the same level of military or territorial expansion as some of his predecessors, his reign was still marked by relative stability. Jotham is often praised for his personal integrity and devotion to God. Unlike some other kings, he did not turn to idolatry. In fact, he rebuilt the upper gate of the house of the Lord in 2 Chronicles 27, verse 3, suggesting that he was keen on maintaining the sanctity and holiness of worship in Judah. Jotham also took active steps to ensure that proper worship was upheld, and he strengthened the religious institutions at that time. However, while he was committed to following God, the high places, the local worship sites outside of Jerusalem, were not removed during his reign. This indicates, perhaps, that while Jotham himself was righteous, the people were not entirely purged of their idolatrous practices. Indeed, that is true. Jotham's reign also featured military strength and successes. While Judah didn't expand greatly during his reign, Jotham defended his kingdom effectively and dealt with external threats. One of Jotham's significant military victories was against the Ammonites. Ammonites, another idolater. You see these particular countries that are mentioned. You'll find them in Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 26. I think it's a great study, which I myself have put together, but many others probably have that I'm unaware of. How important it is to understand these areas of their idolatry, their cutting of trees, their idol worship, and all those type of things. I think it's really important to look into that. But as I said before, one of the significant military victories that he had was against the Ammonites, who had been a persistent threat to Judah. Jotham led successful campaigns that forced the Ammonites to pay tribute to Judah for 3 years, showing his diplomatic and military strength. Jotham also continued the fortification of Jerusalem that had been started by his father Uzziah. He strengthened the city's defenses and built towers in the forest of the city of David, ensuring the physical security of Judah. 2 Chronicles 27:4. 2 Chronicles chapter 27, verse 4. These measures would prove important to the years, or in the years that followed, especially when the kingdom would face increasing threats from both Israel and foreign powers. Jotham's reign also was characterized by economic stability and prosperity. Although the Bible does not go into great detail about his economic policies, you see a bit of it. You talk about the successful tribute payments from neighboring nations like the Ammonites and so forth would add wealth to the kingdom. Although Jotham is portrayed as a righteous king, there were signs of trouble brewing during his reign, particularly with regard to the northern kingdom of Israel. Toward the end of Jotham's reign, the prophet Isaiah begins his ministry, and the threat of Syrian and Israeli invasions began to loom larger. However, Jotham did not face these threats directly, as he died before they reached their full intensity. His son Ahaz, who would succeed him, would face far more significant difficulties from these encroaching and approaching powers. During Jotham's reign, the northern kingdom of Israel, under the rule of Pekah, was involved in military conflict with both Syria and Judah. Jotham himself avoided direct confrontation with these powers, and his reign was largely peaceful compared to his successors. Although the growing tensions between Israel and Syria marked the backdrop of his reign, he managed to keep Judah secure and prosperous, but did not completely eradicate the idolatry that had crept into the kingdom through high places. And we deal with that still today. Jotham's death at the age of 41 marked the end of a relatively stable reign. His son Ahaz succeeded him, and the contrast between their reigns is again interesting. Jotham's son Ahaz would prove to be a wicked king, which we will discuss next week, who led Judah into idolatry and military alliances with foreign nations, including Assyria, which led to a very much a disastrous consequence for the kingdom. Jotham's reign, however, left a legacy of righteousness. Even if it wasn't fully realized among the people, his efforts to maintain the spiritual health of the nation through personal faithfulness and the defense of the temple and military strength laid a foundation of stability that unfortunately would be undermined by his son's disobedience. Jotham's reign demonstrates that even in the face of external pressures, a king or leader who remains faithful to God and strives to maintain righteousness will often experience God's favor. Though he was unable to fully rid the kingdom of idolatry, Jotham's personal righteousness is a key aspect of his reign that brought peace to Judah. While Jotham was personally faithful to God, he did not remove the high places where the people continued to worship idols. This partial reform meant that despite his righteousness, idolatry persisted, leading to spiritual decline after his death. Jotham's military successes show that faithful leadership often requires courage to act decisively. His victories over the Ammonites and his efforts to strengthen the defenses of Judah ensured that his kingdom was both spiritually and military secure. This is a reminder of the need for leaders to act to protect their people both spiritually and physically. Jotham's reign provides an example of how the next generation can absolutely drastically change the course of a nation. Despite Jotham's faithfulness, his son Ahaz would be disastrous and would have a disastrous reign that would lead Judah into idolatry. And he would seek alliances to foreign powers, undermining the stability that Jotham had worked to maintain. We see that happen around the world for the last couple of centuries. King Jotham's reign was marked by personal righteousness, military success, and spiritual devotion to God. His efforts to strengthen Judah both politically and spiritually laid the groundwork for his son's reign, which would, as we said before, unfortunately be marked by a rather sharp departure from God's ways. Jotham is remembered as a faithful king, but his story serves as a reminder that righteousness must be complete to be fully effective. Though he didn't remove all the idolatry from Judah, his reign was still characterized by peace, prosperity, and spiritual faithfulness. In a time when other kings were leading their nations astray, Jotham's reign shines as a period of relative stability at that point. But unfortunately, as we will talk about next time, his son's failure shows the need for continual vigilance in preserving God's ways. Thank you for listening to this evening. I'm always grateful and thankful for your time. And with that, I say God bless and have a beautiful day.